The full force of the Illuminate threat has finally invaded the galaxy, and oh boy am I excited to break down all the different units they have. So get ready, because today we're going to cover a lot. We're going to cover every single Illuminate unit as a standalone unit. We're going to cover how those units are used to fight against Super-Earth. And finally, we're going to cover how all those units work together to create the full fighting force of the Illuminates. But before we get into it, let's talk about today's... I had you scared there. No, there's no sponsors here. Just, if you like my videos, I'd love you to hit that subscribe button down below, because that truly is the best way to support my channel. Okay, now let's actually get into it. The full force of the Illuminate army finally showed itself when they attacked at Widow's Harbor. This was an absolutely shocking moment for the Super-Earth forces, as they saw these huge Illuminate overships coming into orbit to capture the planet, and they very quickly moved on to lay siege to Super-Earth. Which, as of the recording of this video, they are still laying siege to. And if you're watching this video now, you better be defending Super-Earth. Like, pretty please. Like, if you're watching this, go defend Super-Earth right now. We need help. Or, if you're already watching this after Super-Earth has been saved, because, there's no way that Super-Earth can fall, I hope. If you're watching this after Super-Earth has been saved, great job, thank you. But frantic ramblings aside, let's talk about the very first Illuminate unit here, the Voteless. You loved them at one point, and now you hate them because the Voteless were former Super-Earth citizens who have been transformed quite viciously into monstrous zombies that now attack you. There's not a ton to say about the Voteless here because they're a very simple unit. They are essentially just frontline cannon fodder. They just run at you with their horribly malformed claws and try to chop you in half. There's not much to them. They don't have much thought process. They don't have much strategy. They just run straight at you. But with the Illuminate full invasion here, we learned a little bit more about their creation process because there's a new unit, a much bigger sort of Voteless that has appeared now, the Flesh Mobs. The Flesh Mobs are a brand new unit to the battlefield, and they are terrifying to look at. They are literally, as it sounds like, a whole random pile of flesh, and you see all sorts of faces all over them, and they've got all sorts of arms on them, and they just barrel straight at you, much like the Voteless, but much faster, and much bigger, and with a whole ton more health than the Voteless. These Flesh Mobs here serve a very similar role to the Voteless as just frontline cannon fodder. They're going to run at you and try to chop you in half with their big claws. But they do a much better job at it. The Voteless can usually be taken down in a couple shots, whereas these Flesh Mobs here can eat bullets. They take a lot more to take down, and that's not because they're heavily armored, it's just because they have a ton of health because of all their flesh. But I do want to talk about these units side by side for a moment, because the Voteless have been on the battlefield for quite a long time now. We've seen plenty of them, and we know for certain that they are former Super-Earth citizens that have been turned into zombies that serve the Illuminates. But we didn't know a whole lot about how that process worked. And the Flesh Mobs here, as I mentioned earlier, actually give us some insight into how that process is done, because I believe the Flesh Mob is a failed transformation of Voteless. So we know somehow through either dark magic or just wild mixes of chemicals, the Illuminate are turning citizens into these Voteless. And almost certainly, as they did this, there was some failures they had. While they were figuring out the process, the Illuminate scientists, you want to call them scientists, or maybe dark magicians, or whatever they do to turn these into Voteless, they must have had some failures. They must have had some times where they messed up and like, oops, we didn't turn that one into a zombie. That one's just straight up dead. Throw it in the pile. And they started collecting these piles here, and with all the wild dark magic flying around and chemicals being thrown around, these piles of bodies most likely coalesced into these Flesh Mobs here. And I'm sure at first they were like, oh god, that thing is terrifying. Put it down, get rid of it, put it in a hole. But as they ramped up Voteless production, because they wanted to invade Super-Earth here, they needed to really step up their process here. They had to cut corners. They couldn't be as careful creating Voteless. And they had to have lots more piles laying around. And what happens when you have all these piles? As I mentioned earlier, they turn into Flesh Mobs. And they probably had so many, they're like, you know what? We might be wasting a useful resource here. Instead of just tossing them in a big pit, what if we kept them in big cages, because they're probably much harder to control than normal Voteless, because, you know, they're just a shambling pile of terrifying flesh, and God, I hate looking at this thing. But what if we kept this in a giant cage, and when we invade Super-Earth, we just drop them off and release them, and just let them run around? And that is most likely what was done here. The Illuminate realized that their failures could have some use to them, so they started saving their horrific piles of failures and just release them onto the Super Earth population to cause terror in not only population, but even the Helldivers, because these things, again, as I mentioned, are awful to look at. But I think that's enough about the Voteless and the Flesh Mobs together, so let's move on to the next unit. The next units from the Illuminate I want to talk about are the various Overseers. You've got your standard ground Overseer with their spear that shoots big plasma balls at you. You've got the elevated Overseer with their little submachine gun, and we've got the brand new Overseer that has just shown up, the Crescent Overseer. Now, I'm not going to leave you hanging here and talk about the Overseers we know stuff about first. Let's talk about that Crescent Overseer, because this is the new one here, and this one is kind of exciting. This Overseer here acts more like fire support for the Illuminate. This one here has a giant gun that'll shoot over walls, shoot over buildings right at the Helldivers, and if it knows where they are, it's pretty darn precise. This here acts almost like a mortar. It's lobbing these big explosive plasma balls over, and they are deadly if you stand still for too long. But let's also go back and talk about those other Overseers as well, because we know plenty about them so far. The standard Overseer stands on the ground. It's got this big, fancy, glowing blue shield it pulls up that can block a whole lot of fire before it breaks. And it's got what seems like a plasma spear of some sort that it can, one, just smack you with outright because it's a giant chunk of metal, and that, in fact, hurts a lot. Or it can charge up and shoot a big bolt of plasma of some sort at you. And finally, that elevated Overseer, as the name implies, can fly. It's got a jetpack on it, and it's got a little submachine gun. It seems to shoot projectiles that are very similar to the main Overseer's plasma ball, except much smaller and much faster, and, they hurt a lot less because they're much smaller, but they still do hurt. So this elevated Overseer just buzzes around the battlefield like a very annoying little bumblebee that has a gun. So with that, let's talk about the Overseers more as a whole. Because like I said, the Flesh Mobs and the Voteless, they're like the frontline units. They're just eating up all the shots from the Helldivers, and they're trying to just get in there and become a nuisance. The Overseers are the ones that are actually trying to take out Helldivers here. More likely than not, these Overseers are true Illuminate that are controlling these Voteless zombies, and I don't really know if they're controlling the Flesh Mobs. Maybe they can to some extent, but I think the Flesh Mobs truly are just loose on the streets and they just let them go do what they want. But they're the ones that are controlling those lower level units. They're guiding the Voteless around. They're showing them where to go to. And these Overseers are the ones that, once the Voteless kind of pick up a target, they move to that area to try to take out the Helldivers with their much more advanced weaponry. The spear, the gun, the giant mortar. And in a time when the Illuminate were not a species that was going extinct from the galaxy, these three would likely be the main fighting force of the Illuminate. These would be the frontline troops. The main Overseer, this would be the guy right on the front line, doing melee combat if it needs, shooting spear shots at close range. Your elevated Overseer would be buzzing above, shooting at things as they're able, and just kind of causing an overall distraction and chaos. And that Crescent Overseer would be fighting fire support like a mortar where needed. But I do want to talk about that for a brief moment as just a general idea of the Illuminate, because I mentioned in a different time, if they were not in this current state they're in, these would be the main forces. They are in this tough time because in the First Galactic War, humanity was able to push the Illuminate out of the galaxy and beat them back so badly, they contained them to just their home planet and made them sign a peace treaty, and they were almost destroyed. But Super Earth, being the wise ones they thought they were, said, you know what, we're going to keep you around because we want to steal all your technology. So you're going to make technology for us, and this could not possibly go bad at all, and they wouldn't go evil and come back even more powerful than before and take over the Super Earth and stuff. We're not getting to the point here, but they got to this point because they were pushed so near the brink of total defeat that they got desperate and they decided to make those Voteless and Flesh Mobs. What we see from the Illuminate today used to be a far more coherent fighting force. They weren't just using zombies willy-nilly to eat up shots. They were a far more tactical fighting force. And like I said, you can see that in the use of the Overseers here. And as well as our next unit, because they did have a scout as well, which they still do have. The Watchers. These are the giant floating eyeballs that chase you around the battlefield, glow purple, and call in reinforcements from the warp ships, which we'll talk about later. But we're talking about the Watchers right now because these were the true scouts right now and before. In a normal Illuminate force, these scouts would have been going around the battlefield and telling the Overseers where to go to where the biggest threat was. Now the Watchers are fully autonomous and basically just call in reinforcements when they run into something. But I do want to discuss about something interesting about the Watchers here, because I mentioned fully autonomous. I don't think that there is any sort of living creature inside of this Watcher. It seems to be fully mechanical. When you destroy it, there's no blue blood that flies out with like the Overseers and the Voteless. It just kind of makes mechanical noises and falls apart and crashes to the ground. I think this is truly a drone that the Illuminate have made that flies around and summons in reinforcements when needed. But this kind of wraps up the Illuminate infantry, let's call it. These are the basic forces of the Illuminate. This is not the heavy armor, this is not the flying things, because I tell you what, those do exist, and we got a couple new ones of them recently when they invaded Super-Earth. So let's talk about the first heavily armored unit of the Illuminate here, the Harvester. The Harvester here is a very interesting unit because it works kind of like a tank for the Illuminate here. It's heavily armored, and it's got a very powerful cannon in the front. Now, the Harvester's cannon differs pretty heavily from the other Illuminate weapons we've discussed so far, because I don't think this is a plasma ball shooter like the rest, because when you see this thing charge up, it immediately turns into a giant laser beam, which implies more that this is in fact a giant laser coming out of its face. Now, the Harvester here likely has a large laser-generating coil inside of the body here that continuously charges up energy, and once it's full power, it can shoot that laser beam for a while at super high powers. It's enough to just melt straight through any force it runs into. Which also kind of explains why it's a very tall walker here. Well, on the surface, it may seem like kind of a bad design to have a big armored unit like this be a walker, with only 3 legs nonetheless. These seem like very easy points of failure. If you shoot out one leg, the whole thing just topples over. But they wanted this thing to be tall because of that laser weapon. If this thing was much closer to the ground, sure, it'd be more stable and it'd probably be more survivable. But it could not use that laser weapon to such a great effect. You have a small hill, it's a laser. You can't, like, lob it over the hill like the Crescent Overseer with their kind of plasma mortars. No, this thing needs to be able to directly see what it's shooting at. So, if it's got these tall armored legs, it can see up over buildings. It can see up over small hills. Really, the only thing it can't see over is the really tall buildings of Super-Earth or big mountains that are in the way. But not only that, the Harvester here is the first unit we've talked about so far that has a shield. This shield is a very powerful energy field around the Harvester that blocks all sorts of projectiles, energy projectiles, lasers, bullets. It stops everything. This mostly implies that since, again, like I said, it can stop energy and lasers, that's okay, it just has an energy field. But since it can stop metallic bullets as well, this likely may be a magnetic field of some sort as well. And how is this powerful shield generated, you may ask? It is generated by these 2 tall spikes on the top and bottom of the Harvester's head. And we know this because you can take those spikes out, and if you do, the shield does not respawn. So, these spikes are likely power up some form of energy or magnetic field that it kind of spins up between these 2 spikes and gets it going, and then powers it up into this large, powerful shield. And you'll see this as when you take down the shield, it takes a moment to spin back up, so it likely needs to build back enough energy to become a useful field once it's finally broken. Now, I've talked about it for the previous units, so let's talk about for the Harvester here. How does the Harvester fit into the Illuminate, let's call it their force structure? How does it fit into the Illuminate army forces? The Harvester here is likely heavy fire support that they use. This here is what gets called in when the Voteless and Flesh Mobs can't get through. The Overseers can't take something down. They need something truly heavier to take down some heavy defenses. Like, so let's say there's a big Helldiver wall. There's a lot of them there. They got to break through it. They've just got too much stuff right now. The Harvester can come in with its big laser and take down those much heavier units that the normal Overseers can't handle. But, speaking of heavy fire support, the Illuminate do in fact have aircraft that they use, and oh boy are they very interesting to talk about because they are terrifying to fight. Oh man, I have died to them so many times so far on Super-Earth, I tell you what. Hey, yeah, if you're not defending Super-Earth from the Leviathans that are flying right now, please get out there and defend Super-Earth. Okay, I know I said frantic ramblings were done, sorry about that, but let's get back to the Illuminate aircraft here. Let's talk about their first one. They have the Warp Ship. This is the most basic aircraft that the Illuminate have, and really it acts as a transport. But that does not mean that it does not have some interesting features. The warp ships have 2 ways of delivering troops onto the battlefield. They can land, open up their doors, and continuously offload Voteless onto the battlefield, or if they get called in by a Watcher, if they're just kind of flying in to reinforce an area, they can use a teleporter they have on board to beam down all sorts of different units. They can even beam down Harvesters. Now, you may be asking yourself, Nate, why is this an interesting unit? This is just a transport that drops off other interesting units. I think it's interesting because when it lands, when it opens up those blue glowing doors that you can blow up so deliciously, it offboards all sorts of voteless and overseers continuously, like more than could evenly reasonably fit inside of this warp ship here. Makes me think inside of the warp ship is some sort of teleportation technology that can portal in units from wherever the Illuminate home world, staging base, whatever it is, and send them straight onto the battlefield. So this here truly is like a teleportation tether. They can bring in units and drop them off on the fighting location. But one more interesting thing about the warp ship here, it does have a shield, much like the Harvester. But what's interesting is this shield is not a bubble shield like the Harvester's. This shield is fitted directly to the skin of the warp ship itself. And this most likely is generated by some large rotating magnet energy field, something that's going inside the warp ship, and it's likely a big ring around the outer edge that as it generates this field, it kind of channels it into the skin of the warp ship. There's likely some kind of conductive metal on the outside that can retain this charge and keep that energy very close to it, and also still effective enough to stop projectiles coming at it. And again, you'll notice that as you do shoot things in the warp ships here, that shield gets overloaded, and likely it can only generate so much energy field before it's disrupted by things flying at it and causing it problems. And, again, much like the Harvesters, this does spin up after a while. It seems to take a little bit longer than the Harvesters, which is gameplay-wise likely to give you enough time to chuck a grenade in the door. But it does take that time to spin back up, applying, again, there's something large in there spinning and generating energy, and it takes a while before it's an effective shield again. And you'll even notice, once it does spin back up, it starts in its purple damage state. It's not immediately at full health and ready to go, it's kind of damaged and needs even more time to get back up to full power. But that's enough about the warp ship. We know about the warp ship, it's been in the game. Let's talk about the two new exciting Illuminate aircraft, the Stingray and the Leviathan. And first up, the Stingray. Or some also call it the Interloper. It's kind of got both names. It's unclear of which this truly is. So Stingray, Interloper, same thing. It's this thing here that looks, well, kind of like a Stingray. Not 100%, but kind of like a Stingray. What this thing is essentially the Illuminate version of the Eagle that the Helldivers get. This thing will fly around the battlefield and do strafing runs to try to take out Helldivers. And it does it with these two very large cannons in the front. And these cannons shoot massive plasma balls down in a huge run along a set path that you can see lit up before it does its attack. And these plasma balls are very deadly, because if you are in the path, you are dead. Unless you're on the very edge of it, you're just immediately vaporized. So, we know the Illuminate use both kind of plasma balls from the Overseers and laser weapons from the Harvesters, and the Stingray's weapon here most likely falls more into the plasma balls, and it seems like pretty much every shot from the Stingray is essentially a Crescent Overseer's mortar shot, and just in rapid-fire succession, because this is a big enough craft that it can carry a weapon like that. But let's talk about, too, how does this thing fly? Because this is, in fact, a flying aircraft. It seems to have these two large circular openings that act as engines that propel the craft forward, around, and it does seem to fly like the Eagles of the Helldivers in kind of sweeping motions, because you'll even see in the skies, before this thing attacks, it swooping around very quickly, and it only slows down to do these attack runs. Now, talking about engines brings up a very interesting point about the Stingray, Interloper, whatever it is here. I personally like the name Stingray better, so I'm going to call it the Stingray. Why haven't we seen the Stingrays on the planets that the Illuminate have previously invaded? I think there's a very particular reason for that. That's because this ship does not have a warp drive in it. It cannot travel faster than light, so it can't get to these planets. This Stingray here likely only appeared now because the overships have showed up on Super Earth. The absolutely massive ships the Illuminate have brought in to begin their more serious invasion. Since these things can't travel faster than light, they likely needed to be carried in on the overships and are now dropped off, again, much like the Eagles are carried on the Super Destroyers or the Democracy Space Station. Eagles cannot travel faster than light, and I don't think the Stingrays can either, and that's why we're just seeing them now and didn't see them in previous invasions, because let's be honest, the Stingrays are, well, they do a serious amount of damage. They aren't a terribly difficult enemy to deal with. Like, these could have fit well into the earlier attacks because they're fairly lightly armored. One shot from an EAT anti-tank and boom, it's down, it crashes. It's not a particularly heavily armored target. So, I think that is the reason we are just finally seeing them now. They cannot travel faster than light. But to wrap up this discussion on the Stingrays, let's talk quick again about how they fit into the entire forces of the Illuminate here. Where do they fit into their battle structure? The Stingray here, again, is likely another fire support weapon that the Overseers can call in. If there's a big line of Helldivers they want to take out, they could maybe call this thing in for a strafing run and just wipe out the whole line and then continue moving forward. This thing here is meant to be a support weapon. It's not gonna land and start, like, attacking on the ground. It doesn't make any sense, it's an aircraft. This here is a support weapon that the Overseers call in when they see a problem that is bigger than they can deal with, and maybe even the Harvesters can't deal with. And with that, let's move on to talk about the last Illuminate enemy that you actually fight on the battlefield. There's the overships up there, which we will talk about, but you don't fight them on the battlefield, so let's talk about the Leviathan here. This is the last enemy that you face on the battlefield. The Leviathan is an absolutely massive, flying, whale-like ship, and it floats around, and it's got 4 cannons on the front that might as well just be sniper rifles, because I swear, all the time, I'll be just walking around in an Illuminate mission, and boom, just get sniped out of nowhere. It's a Leviathan. Every single time, it's a Leviathan that has just sniped me across the map. I don't know how they're so accurate with those things, but they are deadly. And that's not the only weapon that's on the Leviathan. The Leviathan also has a whole bunch of plasma bomb droppers directly under it. They're less of a threat to Helldivers, but man, can these things wreak havoc on the streets of Super Earth. And these Leviathans, unlike the Stingrays, are very heavily armored. Taking these things down is a huge pain. Honestly, the easiest way to take them down, if you're curious, is calling in the anti-tank emplacement far away and aiming at one of the front wings and taking it out to reveal the squishy bits underneath, because all the armor all over this is essentially tank armor that can only be penetrated by heavy weaponry. This thing is a monstrosity, and on the battlefield here, it is a serious threat to deal with. And much like the Stingrays, I think the Leviathan here does not have any fast and light travel capabilities. And for the same reason, that is why we have not seen it on the battlefield until the overships appeared in the sky. Because the overships, again, are likely carriers for these 2 aircraft, the Stingray and the Leviathan. But again, speaking of engines, I want to talk about how the Leviathan moves, because it moves very differently from the Stingray. This thing kind of like floats through the air like a fish would glide through the water. This here, it just glides around buildings. You'll see it like curving up and curving around. This Leviathan here likely uses similar flight technology to the warp ships. It uses some sort of anti-gravity thing to propel it around and propel it forward, because it moves very, very slowly. It doesn't even seem to have any backwards-facing engines to propel it quickly. It's likely because they intend this thing to just float around the battlefield slowly and be able to just take hits while it drops off devastating firepower. And for this final unit, let's talk about where the Leviathan fits into the battle structure of the Illuminate army here. How is this thing used? I don't think that the Leviathan is called in by the Overseers on the ground. I think this is controlled by much higher level commanders that are up on the overships. They're likely send in these Leviathans as big, huge bombers to take out more strategic targets. Try to take out the factories of Super Earth. Try to take out the much bigger targets, because it's got these bombs on the bottom. This thing is just floating over slowly and destroying massive areas, which is kind of how you see it being used in the cities of Super Earth. Well, yes, it'll take out a Helldiver if it sees them with its front sniper cannons. Mainly, it's just floating around the city, dropping all sorts of giant plasma bombs around and just wreaking havoc and destroying everything. These Leviathans here are probably the ones that are mainly responsible for destroying the buildings and destroying whole cities themselves. And that brings us finally to our last new Illuminate unit. It's not exactly a unit, it's more of just a sky feature. The overships. These are massive Illuminate ships, which I would like to make an apology for my last video. In my last video, I said that they were about the size of a super destroyer. I was very wrong. At that point, I had not done the destroy the overship mission. I have now. No, they're huge. They're massive. They sit in the sky like a giant, terrifying presence, and when you shoot them down, they don't even land on the battlefield. They land somewhere far off the battlefield. So these things are massive. They're probably the size of like 50 super destroyers put together. These overships, like I've mentioned about the aircraft earlier, are likely meant to be carriers for all the other ships. These are the ones that bring in the whole army to do the attack on an area. And as we see in the Destroy the Overship missions, these overships are very heavily shielded as well. You shoot these giant planetary defense cannons at them, and it takes quite a few shots to take it down. It's not just like one shot and the whole thing blows up. No, it's like 8 you need to pound it with before it finally falls out of the sky. And I think that these overships here are where the commanders sit. This is where the high-level generals sit and control the battlefield plans. They're in here telling the overseers where to go, and then the overseers tell the voteless where to go. They're the ones bringing in those leviathans, like I just said. They're sending those leviathans off to bomb important targets. Up here in the overships is where the true battlefield control is going on. And with that, that truly rounds out all the forces that the Illuminate have to offer at this time. And honestly, they really have pretty much every capability that the Helldivers do now. On the ground, they have mortar support from the Crescent Overseers now. In the air, they've got Eagle Strike capabilities with their Stingrays. And these overships, like I said, very well could have orbital bombardment capabilities like the Super Destroyers. The Illuminate are essentially on par with Super Earth now, which is quite scary, because so far, the Helldivers have not had to face an enemy that is on par with them. The automatons come close because they have that hovercraft, aircraft that shoot at you, but they don't have all the space capabilities that the Illuminate do here. The Illuminate are truly a terrifying enemy when you add up their forces all together. Now, this video went on for a lot longer than I honestly intended it to, but you know what? The Illuminate are a very fascinating enemy to talk about because, like I mentioned, they're on par with Super Earth at this point, and it's very fun to dissect into how their force structure works. Hopefully you enjoyed this video as well, and if you did, love if you have a like down below, a comment to give me your thoughts on the Illuminate here, and consider subscribing to the channel and stay tuned for more. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it truly is the best way to support me, and I really appreciate all the love the channel's been getting lately, so please hit that subscribe button if you want to stay tuned for the next video. Thanks, and I'll see you guys next time.